Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we should fear the most. Sometimes the truth hides in plain sight for years, waiting for one moment, one traffic stop, one mistake to bring it all crashing down. Welcome back to True Crime Journal, where we explore the cases that shake us to our core and remind us that evil can wear the most familiar faces. I'm your host, and today we're diving into a case that began with a simple fishing trip in rural Georgia and ended with discoveries that would haunt a small community forever. Before we begin, if you're new here, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Your support helps us bring you these important stories every week. And let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We love hearing from our True Crime Journal family. Now, let's get into today's case. On the morning of September 8, 2015, in Valdosta, Georgia, 45-year-old Demetrius Washington kissed his wife goodbye and loaded his fishing gear into his beloved midnight blue 2003 Chevy Silverado. The truck had been his pride and joy for over a decade, meticulously maintained and polished every weekend without fail. Demetrius was a man of routine and tradition. Every September, without exception, he would take a solo fishing trip to Lake Blackshear, about 2 hours north of Valdosta. His wife, Keisha Washington, had grown accustomed to these annual escapes during their 22 years of marriage. She knew her husband needed this time alone with nature to recharge from his demanding job. He'd been looking forward to it all summer, Keisha would later tell investigators. Had his tackle box organized for weeks, his lucky hat cleaned and ready, even bought new lures the week before at the local sporting goods store. Demetrius worked as a supervisor at the Georgia Pacific Paper Mill, a steady job that had provided well for their family but came with significant stress and long hours. That Tuesday morning, Demetrius hugged Keisha on their front porch of their modest home on Magnolia Street. He promised to call when he got settled at the lake, loaded his cooler with sandwiches and cold drinks, and drove away in his Silverado. The truck's chrome bumper caught the early morning sun as it disappeared around the corner, heading toward Highway 84 North. It was the last time anyone would see Demetrius Washington alive. When Wednesday evening came and went without the promised phone call, Keisha wasn't immediately worried. Cell service at Lake Blackshear was notoriously spotty, especially in the remote coves where Demetrius preferred to fish. He had often joked that the poor reception was part of the lake's charm, forcing him to truly disconnect from the outside world. But when Thursday morning arrived with still no word from her husband, concern began to creep into Keisha's mind. Demetrius was punctual to a fault and had never failed to check in during his previous fishing trips. By Thursday afternoon, when he hadn't returned home as planned, genuine worry had transformed into panic. Keisha made the 2-hour drive to Lake Blackshear herself, hoping to find some reasonable explanation for his silence. She checked all of his usual fishing spots along the shoreline, the boat ramps he frequented, and even stopped at the tackle shop where he often bought bait. No one had seen him. No one had seen the midnight blue Silverado. It was as if Demetrius had simply vanished into thin air. That evening, with trembling hands, Keisha walked into the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office and filed a missing person report. Deputy Marcus Jefferson took the initial report, noting in his file that Keisha appeared visibly distressed but remained coherent and cooperative throughout the interview. He described Demetrius as an experienced outdoorsman with no history of mental health issues, risky behavior, or any reason to voluntarily disappear. The search began at dawn the following morning. Lake Blackshear was a massive body of water, covering over 8,000 acres with countless coves, inlets, and secluded fishing spots scattered along its 100-mile shoreline. Search and rescue teams from multiple counties were deployed to comb every accessible area. Volunteers with boats checked the remote coves. Professional divers searched the deeper waters where a person might have fallen in. Aircraft from the Georgia State Patrol swept the surrounding forest from above, looking for any sign of the missing truck or campsite. For 3 grueling weeks, they found absolutely nothing. No fishing gear, no campsite, no tire tracks, no trace of Demetrius Washington or his beloved Silverado. It was as if both man and machine had been swallowed by the earth itself. Then, on September 29th, a breakthrough that would change the entire trajectory of the investigation. Park Ranger William Thompson was conducting a routine patrol of the more remote areas of the lake when he discovered something that stopped him cold. There, on the rocky shore of an isolated cove nearly 5 miles from the main boat ramp, were Demetrius's fishing rod and tackle box. But there was something profoundly wrong with the scene that immediately caught Thompson's experienced eye. The tackle box was closed and latched securely. The fishing rod was neatly placed beside it, as if someone had carefully arranged it there. There was no scattered gear, no signs of a struggle, no indication that anyone had actually been fishing from that spot at all. Most tellingly, there were no footprints in the sandy area around the gear, no chair or stool where someone might have sat to fish, and no bait container or cooler nearby. Thompson had been a park ranger for over 15 years and had seen countless fishing setups. This didn't look like someone had been interrupted while fishing. It looked staged, like someone had deliberately placed those items there to be found. The discovery of the fishing gear fundamentally shifted the investigation from a potential drowning or wilderness accident to something far more sinister. If Demetrius had been fishing from that remote cove, how had he gotten there? His truck was nowhere to be found, and the location was accessible only by boat or a difficult hike through dense woods. Why would an experienced fisherman choose such an inconvenient spot when better locations were easily accessible? Detective Alicia Brooks was assigned as the lead investigator on the case. A 15-year veteran of the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office, Brooks had handled dozens of missing person cases, but something about this one immediately bothered her. The evidence didn't fit the narrative of a simple fishing accident. Keisha provided investigators with security footage from their home that showed Demetrius leaving that Tuesday morning. The timestamp clearly read 6:23 a.m., confirming her account of when he departed. Gas station security cameras along the route to Lake Blackshear captured the distinctive Silverado heading north around 7:15 a.m., establishing that Demetrius had indeed started his journey as planned. After that final gas station sighting, the truck had completely vanished. Despite extensive searches and statewide alerts, no other cameras had captured the vehicle, and no witnesses had come forward with sightings. Detective Brooks began digging deeper into the Washington family dynamics. What she discovered raised several red flags that would prove significant later in the investigation. Just 6 days after Demetrius disappeared, Keisha had called his life insurance company to inquire about benefits for missing persons. The policy was substantial, worth $180,000, and included a specific clause allowing payment after 180 days if the insured was presumed dead. When Brooks questioned Keisha about the timing of this inquiry, her explanation seemed reasonable on the surface. Financial pressure was mounting rapidly, she explained. Demetrius's paychecks had stopped immediately, bills were accumulating, and as the sole breadwinner's wife, she needed to understand her options for survival. It was logical and understandable, but Detective Brooks filed it away as something to remember. Brooks also discovered that Keisha had been asking neighbors and friends about the legal process for having someone declared dead in absentia. She had researched online about missing person cases and how long families typically had to wait before death could be legally presumed. Again, these actions could be explained by a grieving wife trying to understand her situation, but the timing felt suspicious to the experienced detective. As autumn turned to winter, the active search efforts wound down. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation had assisted with additional searches, bringing in specialized equipment and cadaver dogs, but thousands of acres of wilderness and water had yielded no further clues. The case was transferred to the Cold Case Division, though it remained technically active. Demetrius Washington had simply vanished without a trace. In February 2016, exactly 180 days after his disappearance, Keisha received the full life insurance payout of $180,000. By March, she had moved from their longtime home on Magnolia Street to a smaller, but newer house across town in a more upscale neighborhood. When concerned neighbors and friends asked about the move, she cited painful memories in the old house and her need for a fresh start. Nobody questioned her decision. Nobody suspected anything untoward. In the eyes of the community, Keisha Washington was a grieving widow trying to rebuild her shattered life with the resources her husband had left behind. She was seen as a victim deserving of sympathy and support. But Detective Brooks kept the file active on her desk. Something continued to nag at her, a persistent feeling that they were missing something crucial. She couldn't shake the image of that perfectly placed fishing gear or the convenient timing of Keisha's insurance inquiries. That persistent feeling would prove to be prophetic. 3 long years passed with no developments in the case. Demetrius Washington became another cold case statistic, another family destroyed by unexplained tragedy. His name appeared in annual remembrance articles in the Valdosta Daily Times. His former co-workers at the paper mill held a memorial service on the 3rd anniversary of his disappearance. During this time, Keisha eventually began a new relationship. She met Tyrone Mitchell through their shared church, Mount Olive Baptist, where both had been attending services regularly. Mitchell was a quiet, gentle man with a troubled past that he had worked hard to overcome. Born and raised in nearby Thomasville, Tyrone had struggled with drug addiction throughout his 20s but had been clean and sober for over a decade. He worked sporadically in construction and odd jobs around the area, and friends and fellow parishioners described him as someone who had found peace and redemption through faith and community service. In June 2018, nearly 3 years after Demetrius's disappearance, Keisha and Tyrone were married in a small, quiet ceremony at Mount Olive Baptist. The couple kept largely to themselves, attended church services religiously, and seemed to be building a peaceful, simple life together in Keisha's house. Neighbors described them as a devoted couple who seemed genuinely happy together. Tyrone was often seen helping Keisha with yard work and home maintenance. They were friendly but private, the kind of couple that minded their own business and caused no trouble for anyone. But on April 15, 2019, nearly 4 years after Demetrius vanished, everything changed with what should have been a routine traffic stop on Interstate 75 in Tifton, Georgia, about 30 miles east of Valdosta. Officer Jasmine Carter of the Tifton Police Department was working the evening shift when she spotted a midnight blue Chevrolet Silverado with a broken taillight heading south on the interstate. It was exactly the kind of minor violation that officers encounter dozens of times each week, nothing that should have led to anything more significant than a warning or a small citation. But when Officer Carter approached the driver's window after pulling the vehicle over, something immediately felt wrong. The man behind the wheel was African American, appeared to be in his mid-40s, and was wearing a faded baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. More concerning was his demeanor. He seemed nervous far beyond what a simple traffic violation would warrant, with visibly shaking hands and sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "License and registration, please," Carter requested in her standard professional tone. The man fumbled frantically through the glove compartment, his hands shaking so violently that he dropped papers twice before managing to extract the requested documents. When he finally handed them over to Officer Carter, she glanced down at the registration and felt her blood run cold. The vehicle was registered to Demetrius Washington, the same Demetrius Washington who had disappeared nearly 4 years earlier. The same midnight blue Silverado that had been the subject of statewide alerts, extensive searches, and countless investigative hours. But the man sitting nervously in front of her was definitely not Demetrius Washington. "Sir, can you step out of the vehicle, please?" Carter said, her hand moving instinctively toward her service weapon as her training kicked in. The man, who would later be identified as Tyrone Mitchell, immediately began to cry. Not just tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from years of suppressed guilt and fear. "I can explain," he whispered through his tears. "I can explain everything. Please, God forgive me. I can explain everything." Officer Carter immediately called for backup and transported Mitchell to the Tifton Police Department for questioning. Within hours, detectives from Lowndes County, including Detective Alicia Brooks, had arrived to take over the interrogation. What Tyrone Mitchell revealed in that interview room over the next several hours would completely unravel one of the most shocking cases of spousal murder in Georgia history. But his confession would also reveal something else, something that would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about the case. According to Mitchell's initial statement, he had known Keisha Washington since childhood. They had grown up in the same neighborhood in Valdosta, attended the same schools, and had remained friends even after Keisha married Demetrius in 1993. Their families had been close, and they had maintained contact over the years through church and community activities. Mitchell told investigators that in the months leading up to Demetrius's disappearance, Keisha had begun confiding in him about serious problems in her marriage. She claimed that Demetrius had become increasingly controlling and financially abusive, monitoring her every move and threatening her whenever she expressed any independence. "She was scared for her life," Mitchell said through tears. "She told me that Demetrius had threatened her multiple times, saying that if she ever tried to leave him, he would make sure she disappeared and no one would ever find her body." Mitchell's story was that on September 8, 2015, Keisha had called him in absolute panic early that morning. She claimed that Demetrius had attacked her violently before his planned fishing trip, and that in defending herself with a kitchen knife, she had accidentally killed him. "She was hysterical when I got there," Mitchell recalled. "She kept saying she didn't mean for it to happen, that she just wanted him to stop hurting her. She was terrified that no one would believe it was self-defense because she had no visible injuries and no history of reporting his abuse." According to Mitchell's account, he had rushed to the Washington home and found Demetrius's body in the garage. Keisha begged him to help her, claiming that the police would never believe her story and that she would spend the rest of her life in prison for defending herself. In a moment of panic and misguided loyalty to someone he had cared about since childhood, Mitchell agreed to help dispose of the body. Mitchell's confession detailed an elaborate cover-up that had been both desperate and surprisingly well executed. He claimed that he and Keisha had wrapped Demetrius's body in tarps and driven it in the Silverado to a remote area near the Alapaha River, about 40 miles northeast of Valdosta. They had buried the body in a location that Mitchell said he could identify for investigators. After the burial, they had driven the Silverado to Lake Blackshear, where Keisha had placed the fishing gear on the shore of that remote cove to create the appearance that Demetrius had been there. Mitchell had followed in Keisha's car, and they had both returned home to maintain the illusion of normalcy. For nearly 4 years, Mitchell said, he had been consumed by guilt but terrified of the consequences of coming forward. He had married Keisha not just out of love, but out of a sense of shared responsibility and the secret that bound them together in what felt like a life sentence of deception. "I knew it was wrong from the beginning," Mitchell sobbed during the interrogation. "I knew we should have called the police immediately and told them it was self-defense. But I loved her, and I believed her when she said it was the only way to protect herself from being wrongly convicted." But Detective Alicia Brooks, who had been studying this case for nearly 4 years, immediately noticed several inconsistencies in Mitchell's emotional confession. The timeline didn't quite align with some of the evidence they had collected. Certain details seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. And Mitchell's emotional state, while certainly genuine, seemed to contain elements that felt performative rather than purely grief-stricken. Most concerning to Brooks was Mitchell's claim about Demetrius being abusive. In her extensive investigation, she had found no evidence whatsoever of domestic violence in the Washington household. No police reports, no hospital visits, no complaints from neighbors, no confessions to friends or family members. For a man allegedly violent enough to threaten murder, Demetrius had left no trail of abuse behind him. Brooks suspected they were still not getting the complete truth. While Mitchell was being questioned in Tifton, other detectives had obtained an emergency search warrant for the home that Keisha and Tyrone shared. What they discovered there would completely blow the case wide open and reveal the true nature of what had happened to Demetrius Washington. Hidden in a bedroom closet, wrapped in old blankets and stored in a locked metal box, investigators found documents that painted a radically different picture than the one Mitchell had provided. Inside the box were handwritten notes in Keisha's distinctive handwriting, detailing what appeared to be careful plans for Demetrius's murder. The notes included research about life insurance policies and their payout procedures, detailed information about remote burial sites in the area, maps of Lake Blackshear with specific coves marked, and even a timeline for executing what the notes referred to as the fishing trip scenario. Most damning of all was a letter addressed to Tyrone, apparently never sent, in which Keisha had written, "I know what we have to do now. Dee's getting suspicious about us, and he'll never let me go willingly. We've talked about this enough. It has to look like an accident or a disappearance. The fishing trip is perfect because he always goes alone, and the lake is dangerous enough that people will believe he drowned." The letter was dated August 15, 2015, nearly a month before Demetrius disappeared, completely contradicting Mitchell's story about a spontaneous act of self-defense. When confronted with this devastating evidence, Mitchell's story began to change dramatically. Under renewed pressure from Detective Brooks and the mounting physical evidence, he finally admitted that the killing hadn't been self-defense at all. The truth was far more sinister and premeditated than anyone had imagined. According to Mitchell's revised and final confession, he and Keisha had been carrying on a secret affair for over a year before Demetrius's death. They had fallen in love and had been planning to be together, but Demetrius's presence and the financial complications of divorce had seemed like insurmountable obstacles. They had carefully planned the murder together over several weeks, seeing it as the only way to be together permanently, while also collecting the substantial life insurance payout that would secure their financial future. On the morning of September 8th, Keisha had convinced Demetrius to help her move some heavy boxes from the garage to the attic before he left for his fishing trip. It was a reasonable request that wouldn't have raised any suspicions. When Demetrius bent down to lift the first box, Mitchell, who had been hiding behind Demetrius's workbench, struck him in the head with a heavy metal pipe. Demetrius died almost instantly from the severe head trauma. The couple then executed their carefully pre-planned cover-up. They wrapped the body and drove it to the burial site they had scouted and selected weeks earlier. They staged the fishing scene at Lake Blackshear exactly as they had planned, and they returned home to begin their elaborate deception that had lasted nearly 4 years. It was supposed to be the perfect crime, Detective Brooks reflected later. They had thought of almost everything, planned for every contingency, and had very nearly gotten away with it completely. The one detail they hadn't planned for was Tyrone's psychological inability to live with the constant reminder of their crime. Every time he drove that Silverado around town, every time he saw Demetrius's belongings still in the truck, every time someone mentioned the missing man's name, he was forced to relive what they had done. The guilt had been eating him alive for years, and that broken taillight had simply been the final straw that brought everything crashing down. Based on Mitchell's complete confession and the extensive evidence found in their home, both Keisha Washington and Tyrone Mitchell were arrested and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and insurance fraud. In January 2020, Mitchell led investigators to the burial site near the Alapaha River. After nearly 5 years in an unmarked grave, Demetrius Washington's remains were finally recovered and returned to his family for a proper burial. The trial began in September 2020. Mitchell, who had cooperated fully with investigators after his initial deception, entered a plea agreement. He pled guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy charges in exchange for his testimony against Keisha and a reduced sentence. Keisha maintained her complete innocence throughout the trial, claiming that Mitchell had acted entirely alone and that she had been manipulated and coerced by a dangerous man who had exploited her vulnerability after her husband's disappearance. Her defense team painted her as another victim, a grieving widow who had fallen prey to a manipulative murderer seeking to exploit her emotionally and financially. But the jury wasn't convinced by this narrative. The evidence of premeditation was simply too overwhelming to ignore. The handwritten notes planning the murder, the insurance inquiry just days after the disappearance, the elaborate staging of the fishing scene, and the nearly 4-year deception all pointed clearly to a carefully planned and executed murder. The prosecutor presented phone records showing extensive communication between Keisha and Tyrone in the weeks leading up to the murder, financial records showing they had researched the insurance policy together, and testimony from witnesses who had seen them together during the time period when Keisha claimed to be a grieving widow. On November 12, 2020, after 3 days of deliberation, Keisha Washington was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Tyrone Mitchell received a sentence of 25 years in exchange for his cooperation and guilty plea. He will be eligible for parole in 2045, when he will be nearly 70 years old. Detective Alicia Brooks attended Demetrius Washington's funeral in December 2020. She watched as family members, friends, and former co-workers finally said goodbye to a man whose disappearance had haunted the community for over 5 years. "What struck me most about that service," Brooks said, "was how many people spoke about Demetrius's kindness, his generosity, his love for his family and friends. This wasn't the controlling, abusive man that Keisha and Tyrone had portrayed in their false narrative. This was a genuinely good man who deserved so much better than the way his life ended." The extensive case file shows that investigators found absolutely no evidence of domestic abuse in the Washington household. No police reports, no hospital visits, no complaints from neighbors or family members, no confessions to friends or co-workers. For a man allegedly violent enough to threaten murder, Demetrius had left no trail of abuse or violence behind him. The truth appears to be much simpler and much more heartbreaking than the elaborate justifications offered by his killers. Two people fell in love and decided that murder was easier and more profitable than divorce. Demetrius Washington was 45 years old when his life was taken from him. He left behind 2 adult children from a previous relationship, both of whom had maintained close, loving relationships with him despite his remarriage. They remembered him as a devoted father who never missed a birthday, graduation, or important moment in their lives. Today, Keisha Washington is serving her life sentence at Pulaski State Prison in Georgia. She has maintained her innocence and has filed appeals that have been consistently denied. Tyrone Mitchell is incarcerated at Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison and will not be eligible for parole until 2045. The midnight blue Silverado that ultimately led to their downfall was sold at police auction, with the proceeds going to a victims assistance fund that helps families of violent crime victims. Detective Brooks keeps a photo of Demetrius Washington on her desk as a reminder that every victim deserves justice, no matter how long it takes to find the truth. That concludes today's episode of True Crime Journal. If this case affected you, please remember that domestic violence resources are available 24 hours a day. If you or someone you know needs help, contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Don't forget to subscribe to True Crime Journal and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode.